Thank you. So this meeting is being recorded. So any of you who would not like to be on camera, we're happy that you can like switch on your camera. So and please keep your mics off if you're not speaking. Um, so today is the People's Future from Brazil to Turkey. And we're delighted to have a great panel who agreed to be with us today. So good morning, good afternoon. And we'll appreciate if you can write your introduction in the chat so that everyone knows about who's in the room, etc. And today is the start of a journey. So in 2026, we have a very important milestone with Action for Climate Empowerment, which is the midterm review. So today, we are reflecting on COP30, but looking forward, right? Like, so looking at the rear view to see what's the landscape to kind of chart the path forward. And something very interesting is that it was deemed the cup of truth. In we are living through what many scholars call an epistemic crisis, which is the moment in which the very foundations of how we know what we know are being coordinatedly assaulted. Authoritarian movements across the globe have understood that controlling information is like the fifth pillar of power, alongside land, labor, capital, and technology. And in this landscape, Action for Climate Empowerment is not a soft a complement to mitigation and adaptation. It is the connective tissue that holds the entire climate regime together. So ACE, as enshrined in the Article 6 of the Convention and the Article 12 of the Paris Agreement, encompasses six elements. And I'm making sure that we all have the same base, right? And these six elements are education, training, public awareness, public access to information, public participation, and international cooperation. Each of these, by design, is cross-cutting. You cannot implement NDC or a climate plan without trained professionals. You cannot build adaptive capacity without an informed and active a whole of society. You cannot hold governments accountable without verifiable data and transparent and public access to it. You can't take action without all the ways of knowing, and you can't protect the rights of people without protecting their right to truth. And you can protect the truth without empowering people to demand it, to recognize it, and defend it. And that is what ACE does. Um, ACE does not sit beside the pillars of climate action. It runs through all of them. So right now, we're witnessing a pattern of authoritarian and extractive regimes that are systematically dismantling the infrastructure of truth. Scientific institutions are being defunded. We see environmental data being erased. Researchers, indigenous and frontline activists are being silenced and criminalized. And this is not coincidental. When we destroy a society's capacity to understand the climate crisis, we also destroy its capacity to respond to it. So my pledge is that we stop treating ACE as a secondary or narrow agenda item, and something for the margins of COP, something for side events or voluntary commitments, and start treating it as it is. Like if information is the battlefield of our time, then climate empowerment is our front line. The Paris Agreement success hinges on whether ordinary people have the knowledge, the tools, and the political space to demand and drive climate action. So ACE is not optional, it's an essential for the climate regime. So today we will be hearing from frontline groups, representatives that will be talking about like what COP achieved to their bases, and what lies ahead. Um, so first off, I'm gonna welcome Brian Bishul. He's from the um, he's from El Pueblo Maya Suchuyil, and he's the coordinator, the global coordinator of the coalition CIRGE. Welcome, and we're super happy to have you. Just trying to make sure that you're on camera. Yes.
Yes, I'm here.
Awesome. Welcome.
Okay.
So yeah, so we what we know, that Belém was a huge moment for bringing visibility for Indigenous people in one way or another, and a lot of mobilization from the Indigenous people since we were in the Amazon, and which had an unprecedented presence of Indigenous and traditional knowledge in some of the texts. So I want to know what was achieved, what was co-opted, and what must be protected or changed heading into COP31. So thank you so much for being with us and sharing.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Isatis, for the invitation. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm sorry, I'm wearing some headphones. Thank you. And if I'm not mistaken, I have 7 minutes to share, correct?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. So Maltior Shevekachala, Niña Hunutilewach. That's a greeting in my indigenous language, which is Maya Tzutuhil. We are an indigenous people located in the highlands of Guatemala. And I also support the Search Coalition, which is the Securing Indigenous Peoples' Rights in the Green Economy Coalition. We are a platform for Indigenous peoples to exercise their right to self-determination and free, prior, and informed consent, especially in this new wave of extractivism that we're seeing as a result of the energy transition. And at the same time, I've been working closely and supporting the Indigenous Peoples Caucus, or more formally known as the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change, in the negotiations at the COP 30, and previously also at previous COPs. So maybe to give some more cross-cutting, I guess, look into what the COP left for us. I think it was absolutely significant that it was held in the Amazon. This was needed because, especially at a time when we are watching the collapse of many ecosystems and threatening also of ecosystems by extractive industries. We weren't too far from mining sites, actually, in the Amazon as well. So it was important to bring this visibility also to this region, because we all talk about the Amazon, about the lungs of the world, but more action is needed to really protect it. So the first thing I can share is that we welcomed with a lot of hope that the Brazilian government actually during the COP announced that they would recognize 10 new indigenous territories from many indigenous peoples, right? Some of those territories also have are territories where indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation and initial contact live, which is an important also uh, justice issue that we need to continue advancing around the world. So that's one of the biggest news that we had from the COP. But also, I think it's important for us to talk about maybe some of the good and the bad, because there were mixed results basically from what happened at the COP. And if we look at the Mutirao text, for example, it was frankly disappointing, because I don't think this is what all of us expected. All of us expected more stronger language on phasing out fossil fuels, a commitment at least to phase out fossil fuels, and that's still not happening. And so we can witness the power of corporations around the world to secure their interest in the text. So that's important. Also, references to Indigenous peoples' rights in the text of the Mujirao text were in the preambular paragraphs, which honestly is not, it doesn't really give a lot of leverage to indigenous peoples in securing in their indigenous their rights and also in advancing indigenous peoples' rights around the world. So and then I also want to make some emphasis also on the Just Transition Work Program, because the Just Transition Work Program was, I think, one of the biggest advances that we have had as an Indigenous constituency. It was a very tough negotiation, but we were able to introduce text, and you can see it in the chat. I shared an article about this specifically on this issue. But we are living at a time at this moment in our history as a humanity where we are watching also what many academics and people in the industry are calling the energy transition or the just transition, right? And it's mainly a narrative because what we are experiencing, it would better be described as energy addition. We are not transitioning away from dirty ways of producing energy into cleaner ways of producing energy. What we are doing is just expanding really the production of energy in all forms of production, really. And one of the biggest threats that indigenous peoples face is mining for energy, for minerals for the energy transition. This includes minerals like copper, lithium, cobalt, manganese. Um, and it is important to know that about 54% of the minerals that are currently being extracted and used for the energy transition are being extracted from the lands of indigenous peoples. And these are lands that overlap with protected areas, at least 40% of protected areas. It's estimated 54% of intact forest, 40% of key biodiversity areas. And these territories are essential for climate regulation, for carbon sinks, and so on. So there are two narratives, basically, because we're watching, especially in the net zero narrative, where basically we're being told there's no other way, so we have to transition away and use the minerals to produce technologies for renewable energy production. And it's a dangerous narrative. We're not saying we shouldn't transition. Of course, we need to transition, but at the same time, we need to discuss issues such as consumption and energy justice. Who are we producing energy for? Right? Who pays the cost of that energy production? And unfortunately, at this moment, indigenous peoples are paying the cost of the energy transition, of the so-called energy transition, because we refuse to discuss a narrative that basically it isn't true, because we are not transitioning away from dirty forms of energy into cleaner forms of energy. And if we look at the Just Transition work program and what was achieved at the COP, we now have paragraph 12I, which is a very significant paragraph in the Just Transition work program, because it basically says that all transition pathways must respect and promote the rights of indigenous peoples, including our self-determination and the right to free, prior, and informed consent. And this is especially important when talking about mining for transition minerals, when talking about infrastructure, energy infrastructure, and also large corridors for energy production, because indigenous peoples have a right to say yes to projects, to say no to projects, or to say yes with conditions. We have a right to say no. And that is what's reflected now in paragraph 12I. And so we hail this as a success of the Just Transition Work Program negotiations. And this is the first time in the history of the UNFCCC that the rights of indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation and initial contact have been recognized. There are about 200 groups of indigenous peoples living in isolation or initial contact around the world, especially in the Amazon basin, but also in Indonesia. But Indonesia, if you look at the situation of Indonesia, there's lots of nickel mining going around. And now with the new deposits discovered in Brazil, rare earths minerals were discovered in Brazil, some of the largest deposit, the second largest deposit after China. So what does that mean for Indigenous peoples, especially for Indigenous peoples living in voluntary isolation? When there is intrusion on the lands of Indigenous peoples living in voluntary isolation, this could literally mean genocide. And so we have to be very careful about the narrative that we are discussing, because what for many people would seem some acceptable level of risk, because climate change is such a huge risk, yes, for everyone. What for some is acceptable level of risk means rights violations for Indigenous peoples. And that is not acceptable for us. We refuse to discuss that narrative. So I know I've run out of time, but there's so much to discuss. And I would just invite you to take a moment, if you have a chance to read the article I've written on the Just Transition Work Program, specifically because the work of the Search Coalition focuses on the issues of mining. And there is so much to talk about because there are so many rights violations and issues. But I hope I get a chance to talk about it later or at other spaces. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian, for sharing with us. And definitely, there's so much to do. There's so much to discuss and work in this line. So happy to continue working. And the idea for today is that we set kind of the baseline and keep trying to work on these issues on the road to COP31. Now I want to welcome Mariana Galdino. She is the co-founder and advocacy coordinator at Instituto de Codifica. Hi, Marina. Mariana. Thanks for joining us. And we saw in COP30, we
Mhm.
saw a lot of discussion about Afro-descendants, and thank you so much for bringing that to the attention, because we know that a lot of these came from being in the country that has the biggest
Yeah.
Afro-descendant diaspora. And as an Afro-Caribbean women, we were delightful to have the representation and really have that strength behind it. Um, and we saw some of the tests recognizing for the first time language on Afro-descendants. So I wanted to say, did the outcome match the visibility from civil society, and how did historical erasure and climate disinformation showed up maybe in negotiations, and what accountability and other agenda items are needed by COP31. So over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Bom dia, meus amigos e colegas do Brasil presente. My name is Mariana Galdino. I am a co-founder and advocacy coordination of Instituto de Codifica, a Brazilian organization that works with citizen generation data in favelas and peripheral communities. And I am an Afro-descendant woman born and raised in a peripheral territory in Rio de Janeiro. And for 5 years, I have worked on combating environment racism in Brazil. And the answer to the question is not yet at the necessary scale. COP30 was very important for explicitly recognizing Afro-descendant population, care work, local communities, and vulnerability territories in process, such as the Just Transition Work Program, GGA, and Gender Action Plan. But naming it naming matters, but recognizing tension has not yet translation into target financing, territorialist policies, or concrete reduction of vulnerability in global south. Historical realities appears when vulnerability is treated as technical or geography, instead of the result of historical inequality and exploitation. In Brazil, as many countries of the global south, the climate crisis cannot separate from environmental racism, gender inequality, and class inequality. They are structural realities. Today, 54% of Brazilian population is Afro-descendant. About 113 million people. Around 30% are Black women, are Afro-descendant women. In favelas and peripheral areas, predominant Black territories face selective state absence and greatly exposed to extreme climate events. Between 2020 and 2023, 23, more than 18% of Brazilian municipalities recorded climate disasters, and over 66% have low adapted capacity. The climate crisis amplifies historical inequalities. Climate misinformation in vulnerable territory is not only the new, it's the absence of basic public information. A research conducted by Instituto Decodifica and local partners map flood impacts in favelas in peripheral communities in Rio de Janeiro and Pernambuco e use citizen generation data. And the finding shows us 64%, 1% had their homes invaded by water, and 59.1% lost furniture or belongings. And 76.9% reside no guidance on how to stay safe during floods. This is not only a communication gap, it's the absence of public protection. It is environment racism in practice. Without information, there is no prevention, and without prevention, there is no adaptation. And without adaptation, in the most vulnerable, there is no climate justice. So the question for COP30 is, what accountability mechanism will be delivered? If you want to move from visibility to results, three elements are essential. The first, equity data and indicators. Climate policies must include disaggregation data by race, gender, territory, and class. What is not measured is not priorities. Second, target and traceable financing. Climate research must reach the most vulnerable territories with transparency and distributed justice. And third, participation with real power. Afro-descendant population and grassroots organizations must be decision makers, not only constants. Without research, metrics, and shared power, inclusion remains symbolic. If climate just does not confront structural racism and historical inequality of power, we risk building a transition that is just in discourse, but inequality in practice. The climate just we defend is intersectional, anti-racism, and territorial. And without implementation, finance, and redistribution of power, it's not save our lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing. And definitely, we saw in COP30, some spaces that were open and some representation, but definitely a lot more that needs to be done for the recognition and also highlighting the needs of Afro descendants. So I want to give some space to want to bring on like Ciro Brito, who is a climate specialist at the Socio-Environmental Institute, to talk to us about what happened with local communities at COP30. We were in a frontline city that was close to the Amazon, and we want to know like, did that translated into outcomes for local communities? How did it materialize in the agenda? We know that for a long time we have had the constituted body of local communities and indigenous people. So please tell us about like how the conversations evolve at COP30 and what do you see as the path forward?
Thanks, Isatis. Good morning, good afternoon. Hi, everyone. I'm Ciro Brito, Climate Policy Specialist at Instituto Socioambiental, Social Environmental Institute, ISA, a Brazilian organization with over 30 years of technical and political experience and defending, supporting especially the territorial rights of local communities, Afro-descendant communities, and indigenous peoples as well, with a primary focus on the Amazon. Um, I would like to thank the invitation of ACE and the partners in this special event. And the question of whether COP being held in the Amazon brought real results for local communities is fundamental from a technical standpoint, but not only technical. Belém played a key role in humanizing climate diplomacy, in our view. But translating this proximity into mandatory agenda items is still a controversial process. One of the most significant milestones we witnessed in Belém was the launch of the Global Forum of Local Communities. I don't know if someone here is part of this Global Forum. This was not just a side event, it was, or it is, a coordinated political pressure structure, which is very important in qualify participation in the local communities, indigenous peoples platform, for instance. The forum was created to fill a historic gap in representation, demanding that local communities have a set and a voice in the governance of climate finance, moving from being passive beneficiaries to becoming formulators. It should be noted that for Brazil and the Amazon region, the historic victory of Afro-descendant peoples that Mariana was mentioning in the COP30 texts is a direct victory for local communities. Quilombola communities, for example, fall into this category, and recognition on their contribution to climate stability is a decisive step toward environmental justice and, of course, climate justice. This finally materializes the intersection between human rights, race, and climate in official documents. Although the Belém Agreement brought a commitment to triple funding for adaptation by 2035 and mobilization targets of 1.3 trillion US dollars, the technical challenge remains in mechanizing access. Local communities still face insurmountable bureaucratic barriers to effectively getting resources to the territory. The so-called Forest Cup advanced the rhetoric of the importance of nature, but it still fails to ensure that financing is disintermediated. Another critical point of stagnation was the omission of the phasing out of fossil fuels in the final text. For the local communities that we've been supporting all these years, the absence of a clear phase-out target represents a direct threat to the integrity of the biomes and the territories of these populations protect. The proximity to the forest in Belém was not enough to overcome political resistance around this issue. What changed from Belém to Turkey was the level of political organization. What's changed from Belém? It's the level of the political organization, sorry. The Global Forum and the recognition of people of African descent, but the local communities in the text are new pillars that strengthen the impacts of local communities. Brazil presents Turkey with a scenario where local communities no longer accept being marginalized. Action for Climate Empowerment, the ACE, should be the instrument to transform or to help to transform these political gains into real capacity building and governance. The path to COP31 requires that the recognition obtained in the Amazon be transformed into binding participation and direct resources. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for bringing that update. And I think um, the recognition and also providing space to local communities was a huge undertaking by groups that are saying, well, the space is not given to us, and we will take it and we will create space and pressure to expand on it. So I think in that same vein, we also saw some advancements on women and gender. So we have a new gender action plan, and I would like to welcome Babita PS from Menstruation Matters and part of the facilitative group on women and gender constituency. Um, so one of the big things this year, and I think like this is my favorite. Let me see if Babita is uh is
Apologies, I can't switch on my video. My bandwidth is really, really
no
low.
worries, no worries. Perfect. I was just trying to make sure that you were here.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think for me, what I when someone asked me like what like is like a key moment for me or a key outcome from COP30, there's like this big questions around like just transition, like global goal and adaptation. But for me, I think like my favorite, one of my favorite outcomes that was made possible by a lot of pressure and still has a lot of gap is the gender action plan. And in this, we saw many things that have been advocated that were placed and secure within the text. So I want to ask you like what shifted, what was achieved, and what does a feminist ACE agenda look like heading into COP31? So starting already bring ACE because Babita is one of our, like OGs in ACE. So take it away, Babita.
Thank you, Curtis. Hello, everybody. I'll be hiding under my beautifully edited profile picture today. I hope everybody is fine. So, gender consideration, like many cross-cutting priorities and negotiation frameworks under UNFCCC, have often been treated as secondary, acknowledged in principle but diluted in practice. So, what shifted over the past cycle is that gender was no longer framed as an add-on through consistent efforts of feminists from around the world. It was recognized as a structural lens for implementation. So, building on the momentum from COP27 in Sharm el Sheikh, where inclusive formats such as World Cafe for ACE which opened real space for integrating gender responsive and intergenerational language, we saw at COP30 a consolidation of that progress within the Gender Action Plan. So commitments were affirmed, the expectation of gender responsive implementation was clarified, and importantly, the link between the gender equality and effective climate outcomes was no longer contested, and it was assumed. So, however, as a feminist working closely with ACE, I would say that progress in text is always meaningful, but the power always lies in implementation. So, one important advancement is that language recognizing women environmental defenders already exists within the Gender Action Plan framework. That's significant. It affirms that women, environmental, and human rights defenders are not peripheral actors, they are central to climate solutions. So, as we look ahead to the next action plan cycle, we must go further. We should explicitly strengthen consideration of women, environmental, and human rights defenders, not only as beneficiaries of protection, but as knowledge holders, innovators, and leaders of place based and community driven solution. Now, what does it mean through the lens of ACE? ACE, through education, training, public awareness, participation, and access to information, provides the operational architecture to deliver on Gender Action Plan. a feminist ACE agenda heading to COP31 would do three things. First, it would institutionalize gender responsiveness across all ACE work streams, not as a checkbox, but as a design principle embedded in curricula, national climate education strategies, public participation mechanisms, and capacity building programs. Second, it would equip and train ACE focal points and coordination bodies to develop, fund, and implement gender focused climate projects. Too often, focal points lack technical gender expertise, or the financial tools are insufficient to translate commitments into action. Feminist ACE agenda invests in that capacity, so gender responsive climate action becomes systemic, not symbolic. And third and final, it would strengthen monitoring and accountability. Integrating a strong language into decision is only the first step. So we must measure whether women are meaningfully participating in decision making, whether the resources are reaching women-led initiatives, and whether protection for women, environmental, and human rights defenders are being upheld at national and subnational levels. Yes, this sounds very, very resource intensive, but without measurement, commitments always remain aspirational. So, if you ask me what shifted at COP30, gender moved from margins toward the center of implementation discourse. The Gender Action Plan was not treated as a parallel track, it was increasingly understood as a foundational to just transition, adaptation, and resilience. And what must define our path to COP31? A feminist space agenda that connects policy language to lived realities, one that protects women and environmental and human rights defenders, one that does not leave behind women with disabilities, one that trains the institution in gender responsive climate governance, and one that insists that empowerment is measurable. Because a climate justice without gender justice is always incomplete, and empowerment without accountability is unsustainable. Thank you.
Thank you, Babita. Thank you so much for that. And I believe that, as you said, making sure that the policy outcomes connect with the lived experience is what we should do and what we're most hopeful for lots of the agenda items at the UNFCCC. Very important to this topic too was the recognition of environmental and human rights defenders, and that the Gender Action Plan includes a mandate to develop guidance to protect and safeguard women environmental defenders. This is a concrete advance that we have not achieved before in any other text. It places defender protections inside UNFCCC gender architecture for the first time. And this agenda also saw some language inside the Just Transition Work Program, with the participation of marginalized groups, and affirms the right-based approaches. So while there are no safeguards that have been established within those within any of those outcomes, or accountability mechanisms for the attacks of against defenders, despite being in one of the most dangerous regions in the world, because we have the data there, but there are also other dangerous areas across the world. It symbolized a breakthrough and a moment that we wish to carry forward and make sure to bring that into the ACE conversation. And one of the salient points also from the Gender Action Plan is that recognizes care, right? Recognizes the care work that women do and places it as an important piece. And I think within that recognition, we should also bring the importance, the leadership, and the caretaking that all of the frontline groups represented today also bring into the climate space. So with that, I want to pass it on to Saher Rashid. She is joining us and talking to us about a very important topic about youth and children. Saher is from Terredes Homes, from Germany. I probably pronounce it wrong, even though like I live a year in Austria. German did not came to me. Osmosis is not a great way to learn another language. But yeah, like we saw at COP30 and in recent years, right? Like we have seen um, the growth of like youth leadership and youth leadership being recognized. However, often it's being tokenized. And we saw youthless digital counter disinformation efforts as well as strong advocacy throughout the whole agenda. So I wanted to say what was or ask of you what was gained, what was tokenized, and what is the international intergenerational accountability demand for COP31? So take it away.
Thank you so much, Isabel. And definitely, osmosis is not the best way to learn the language. So, completely forgiven for the pronunciation. Hello, everyone, from a very sunny Vienna today. I am really grateful for the opportunity to talk about misinformation, disinformation, and what young people are doing, because I think that this is the most critical element if we want to understand what action for climate empowerment is in its very essence in a whole society approach. So well, some of the efforts that we saw time and time again at COP were basically by young people, were basically definitely the myth busting. We came across a lot of initiative by young people. For example, some of them that Tertism organized in the International Youth Academy, which was bringing on the information and the climate negotiation topics accessibly in a translated manner, in a digestible manner, with correct information to young people via different workshops at COP as well as at the Conference of Youth. We also saw this time that there were different pavilions, the setting to talk about from young people regarding information not being only accessible, because that was the main point that we used to hear again and again previously, that information should be accessible. But we found ourselves at COP30 in an environment where we were fighting against science, right? We were again facing the same remarks at the negotiation rooms, where to be able to believe on science was difficult for the room, or to be able to believe that intergenerational equity was difficult in the room. So I think that this is really worth the applaud, the efforts by young people, which were through fact checking or myth busting and translating the negotiation into bit-sized public information that is more digestible, and hence enable young people and other stakeholders to organize better. I want to give one example, a real-time example from how what difference does it make when we make this information accessible in a way that it is understandable and not tokenized. So we might have had a look at the NDC synthesis report, right, which the first time ever has a section on children and young people. Well, it is a great achievement that it does, right? But it also mentions that these NDCs, well, 80% of the NDCs recognize children and young people as crucial stakeholders or are child sensitive. But when you actually read the document very carefully, it was only about 60% or a very limited percent, 73% of the parties who had actually submitted an NDCs. So the data was only coming from those parties who had submitted the NDCs. It does not mean that the advocacy dies to make climate sensitive climate policies more child sensitive. There is a long way to go about it as well, and this is exactly why it's important to make information, to fight against disinformation and make it more accessible. So while we are reading these documents, and if we come across in one way or another this tokenized information or a pattern of communicating data, we call on it and we recognize what is different and what is not. I think that it's also very important to highlight that while we found ourselves at COP30 in an environment where a lot of information was kept away, right? So this is something I want to highlight very much. In week 2, if you followed the negotiations very closely, the schedules were very unpredictable, or the schedules were kept very close for the negotiations. What was very important for all the young people to transmit the information through different groups, through different networks. And there came the whole society approach of working together with, for example, the Human Rights and Climate Change Working Group, which is a broader kind of array of stakeholders where we can find information and, advocate better, because that was the week where we had to push more. I want to also highlight on a win as well, because of course it's also good to talk about good stuff as well. I think that, as Asatis was mentioning about her favorite agenda item being gender action plan, I think that I can echo with it a little bit as well, because this was the first time ever that age disaggregated data was mentioned officially in a UNFCCC text. And this was basically in the new Gender Action Plan, which was adopted at COP30, and it includes commitment to improve gender and age disaggregated climate data. When we want to talk about climate action for everyone and climate action being accessible for everyone or serving everyone, it is very important that we have the data, because we have the facts available, how much of the climate finances are accessible for children and young people, how much of the climate finances is available for children and young people's project, and the projects that impact their lives continuously. The answer is very less. And last but not least, of course, the Just Transition Work Program. I think that it's very one thing that we heard previously was in the Gender Action Plan being care being highlighted. I think that we are at the edge of time where we are all pushing for these very common, very basic, and very justified inclusion of children and young people in terms of rights of children, rights of internally displaced children and young people, rights of displaced children and young people, rights of children on the move, etc. And I think that the Just Transition Work Program showed a little bit of light there. Of course, it's not all, it's all done and it's all good and everything, but I think that the Just Transition Work Programs talk a little bit about the holistic multi-sectorial commitments for children on the move and for young people as well. As families that are giving care to children. And I think that this is very important to highlight as well. I think that what is also very I think that I've already mentioned about the information kept separately or kept, for example, away from children and young people, about the Muchirao decision. So we were pushing a lot on the expert dialogue, which, for the context, there was first expert dialogue on children that happened at the SBs in 2024, and we were pushing for the renewal of the expert dialogue, just like the expert dialogue on mountains that got renewed. But then, of course, due to these information not being accessible and rooms being closed and where to push from, the job was very difficult. Indeed, but of course the journey goes on. And I think, for the sake of time, if I want to also have a lens of continuing from Belém to Turkey, I think that I would really want to mention that if you are a children or young person, and if you want to be contributing more in the midterm review of ACE national plan, ACE action plan, please don't let this opportunity go. This action plan is going to be, your submissions are going to be defining the technical workshops, your submissions are going to be defining what the ACE dialogue will be, and your submissions are going to be defining how children and young people are going to be included. We are working on a submission as a collective of children and young people's organizations. So I'm happy to share that form with you. You you are more than welcome to work on your own submission as well. The deadline is 31st of March to submit, and anybody can submit as an organization and of course the party. So it's a non-party stakeholder submission as well. So make sure that you apply there. And we are also launching this network of Right to a Healthy Environment, Children, Young People's Lab, which is learning, advocacy, and belonging. So please stay tuned, and then let's work together. Just as Isatis was mentioning at the very beginning, that stayed with me completely, that on the grounds that we are on, the misinformation grounds that we are functioning right now, really access to information, organizing better, and coming together as a community are really our superpowers, are really the tools that are going to get us ahead in the race. So let's stay united. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Saher, and for reminding us of the deadlines that lie ahead of us. And I think this comment you made about the the information and also that the agenda being closed also highlight an issue of the civic space within UNFCCC, within COPs. We also saw tensions between security and civic participation. And I think it's very important to recognize that justice-based and participatory climate governance requires safe civic space, protection from retaliation, and recognition of defenders, activists as rights holders, and relational protection systems. And we believe that all of these could be also tied into right, like we started saying that ACE is cross-cutting, but that not only means that that is for agenda items, it is also for the UNFCCC itself. Thank you so much for flagging that. Um, now we move to Gordon Ratray from the Disability Caucus. Thanks for joining us, Gordon, and being with us this morning. And sharing with us the experiences and kind of how the COP30 outcomes measure to your community needs and demands, and what is needed to shift in the design of the COP, of the decisions to make sure that it can respond effectively to people with disabilities. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sadis, and thank you very much to all the previous speakers. It's wonderful to be here as part of this group and as part of this conversation. My name is Gordon Rattray, and I work for the International Disability Alliance, and I'm speaking on behalf of the Disability Climate Caucus. So the first thing I want to make clear, many people think that persons with disabilities are a very small minority, and although there needs to be disability inclusion, I think there's little discussion about that. Perhaps people think it's not that important. In fact, people with disabilities are at least 16% of the global population, so 1 in 7 people. And in climate emergencies, in any humanitarian emergency, that number is greatly increased. So you could see up to 20% of the affected population are persons with disabilities. And we're not a separate group. We're actually part of all the different constituencies. So there are Indigenous people with disabilities, there are youth with disabilities, there are women and girls with disabilities, Afro-descendants with disabilities. We're all together. And this is really what I wanted to start as a fundamental point, is to make sure that everyone is on the same page as far as all of society means that disability is included from the very beginning. To go to COP30, I can speak positively here, and I can say that COP28, COP29, we were really fighting just to be mentioned. Disability is mentioned in the chapeau of the Paris Agreement, but really until very recently, there has been almost no further mention of persons with disabilities. After COP30, we've seen in the Just Transition work program outcome documents inclusion of persons with disabilities when talking about meaningful participation and when talking about human rights and labor rights. We've also got the Belém Action Mechanism, which is going to be a really important tool for civil society as a whole, but perhaps especially for persons with disabilities, because this is when we can ensure that accessibility for persons with disabilities is fully included in Just Transition. The Global Goal for Adaptation specifically acknowledges contributions from many groups, including persons with disabilities, which is also a good step forward. The indicators for the global goal in adaptation mention disability, although it's really important to note that it's here optional or bracketed somehow. And this is what we often see, is that disability is seen as like something nice to have, but not necessary. And of course it's necessary. So this is one of the things that we really need to fight for, is to make sure that these optional clauses are removed and disability is fully included when all indicators are being decided. The Gender Action Plan is the third work stream that I would mention. And the positive thing here is that, again, persons with disabilities or women and girls with disabilities are mentioned when it talks about intersectionality, or indirectly it talks about intersectionality. So this was another step forward. But then bringing us back to reality, there's a new report which came out in November, which I will drop the link into the chat after I speak, which showed that the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions across the world, are really lacking when it comes to disability inclusion. So at this point, 72% of countries don't mention disability at all in their NDCs. That's just top line figure. There's much more detail in the document that I will share. And then very concretely, accessibility. If you want to have a disability included, you have to have people with disabilities at the table, at the decision making. And if you want that, then you need to make sure that there is accessibility in place. So this might mean accessibility for someone using a wheelchair, but it also means accessibility of information. So plain language, providing captioning, live captioning, providing sign interpretation for someone who may be deaf. These are basic essentials. They're not optional extras. And then coming to ACE. So this is going to be a really powerful tool of how we can make differences moving forward. At this point, as I've listed, disability is generally included in lists of identities, of lists of people. And this is quite easy to do, but for real progress, we need to have concrete commitments to concrete actions. At this point, as I understand it, ACE has, through human rights recognition, it talks about persons with disabilities as vulnerable or marginalized groups, but it's rarely actually explicitly mentioned. Secondly, regarding participation, ACE talks about public participation and stakeholder engagement, but again, there's no mention of how this is going to happen. So the need to have budget in place from the beginning for accessibility for persons with disabilities. And thirdly, the Glasgow Work Programme, it encourages inclusive engagement. And again, disability is referenced, but it's not systematically embedded across all the pillars of ACE. So the message here is that, yes, disability inclusion exists in principle, and everyone agrees with this, but it's not yet integrated in practice. And until it's there explicitly mentioned, then it's not going to happen. So finally, what must change? I've put 5 quick points here that I'll mention. The first one is that disability must be explicitly mentioned across all of the pillars of ACE, not just implied, but actually clearly named and operationalized. The second one is that we must have accessibility by design. So I started to list things earlier: accessible communication, sign interpretation, captioning, accessibility of digital platforms, consultation processes must be accessible. Thirdly, we must make sure that there is meaningful participation and leadership of persons with disabilities. So this means identifying representative organizations, inviting them to the table and asking them if they want to participate, what would they need to be able to meaningfully participate? Fourthly, In order to make sure that all of this is working, we need accountability. For this, we need data. We need to know who's been there, what were they doing? Were they aware of what was happening? Was it a checkbox exercise, or were they actually meaningfully participating? There needs to be measurable outcomes, and there has to be dedicated funding to support the implementation. And lastly, as I alluded to earlier, climate inclusion has to be intersectional. So recognizing that it's not just about disability, but it's gender, indigeneity, poverty, age, and all of the other identities that people who are impacted by the climate crisis might have. And then lastly, just as a reminder, this is a human right. It's obvious, as I said, no one disagrees with it, but it's also cost effective, certainly in the long term. And it builds stronger and more inclusive and more functional societies moving forward. I'll stop there and I'll say thank you very much again for the invitation to join, and we look forward to further engagement.
Thanks so much for sharing and sharing, the very important demands that we need to make sure that we're bringing into the A space. And this also makes me think about this term that we use in urban planning spaces. Not that I'm an urban planner, but have heard that is called like the curb cut effect, which is something um, or a phenomenon, right? Like that disability friendly features being used and appreciated by a larger group, right, of people. So you have the curb cut, which is used for or designed for wheelchairs, but then you have moms with strollers that also need that kind of accessibility. You have bikes, like if you're just getting into a place. And also just like general, like for a small person like me, not having like a big stem. Um, but like today we're listing, and thank you, Gordon, for bringing that we list a lot of identities, and those identities need to be brought into actions. And the point of highlighting the different identities is not separation, is to kind of understand what are the accessibility, inclusion, and participation needs of specific groups, and for those to find a way that the solutions can be extended to everyone, and we truly have transformation in the way that we implement ACE, and gather, right? Like first we need to get it on the text, but the idea today is reflecting on that. So thanks so much for reminding us about that. And with that, I want to welcome our last but certainly not least speaker, Jocelyn Perry. And she is today with us, and she will be speaking about uh, migrants, displaced people, refugees, outcomes at COP. She's a senior advocate and program manager at the Climate Displacement Program and Refugees International. And thank you so much for always answering our call and making sure that you are keeping us up to date and collaborating in these issues. So at COP 30, we have that the knowledge that climate accelerates displacement everywhere, but yet usually migration remains largely absent from decision text. And we saw some unexpected mentions that stuck to the final decision text language, and went through. But as we're heading into Turkey, a country that is at the crossroads of multiple displacement corridors, we want to know what was achieved and what are sort of the expectations for COP 31. So thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you, Isatis, and thank you for convening this today. And just wanted to express my appreciation for how the ACE Observatory and all the prior speakers have framed the intersectionality of these issues, because, of course, as others have mentioned, there are so many people with different identities who are also migrants, who are also refugees, and who also have additional or particular needs because of those identities. But I do think that when it comes to working on human mobility and climate change, whether that's people who've been displaced because of climate impacts in part or in full, or people who are displaced by conflict, but then exceptionally vulnerable to climate impacts, is that any of us could be displaced at any time by these circumstances, and could face these differential impacts. The other piece, of course, though, is that these vulnerabilities are often state made or made by policies that states impose on displaced people, on refugees, on migrants. And so while we're operating in a really difficult geopolitical international environment for migrants, for refugees, um, there is also hope that we can change these policies and actually meaningfully reduce people's vulnerability through these policy changes. So I'll try not to repeat too much of what's been said already by the previous commentators, the boon and uh, misfortune of going last, is that a lot has already been said. But I wanted to bring in kind of the outside context as well that COP30 took place in, which is that we're facing just immense cuts to the, in multilateral parlance, humanitarian and development funding system. That these incredibly constrained budget environments for countries are now having an impact on the funding that is available for things like refugee responses, for disaster preparedness and disaster responses. And we saw this at COP, I think, in two big ways, as it pertains to the communities with whom I work, which are often refugees and migrants and internally displaced people. And that was a real decrease in mentions of fragile and conflict affected areas and support for these. And I think that was partly a recognition that the funding is just not there, that there is not funding in most countries' budgets anymore. And this was largely led by the destruction of USAID in the United States, but followed by a lot of other countries in the global north who had previously provided, I don't know, quite small amounts of funding to their national budgets, but major amounts of funding when it comes to the situations where people might be fleeing massive conflict or oppression or violence in their home communities and then facing climate impact in the place that they've been displaced to, with even fewer resources to respond, with less stable shelter, less resilient structures in which they're living, and all sorts of restrictions on their right to employment, on their property and land tenure rights, on their ability to have a bank account or have ID documents that would get them access to services. And so these kind of restrictions increase their vulnerability and compound the difficulty of responding to climate impacts for a lot of these people. And we also see that they're systematically often left out of planning processes for things like national adaptation plans and nationally determined contribution planning processes, because there's this idea, well, for many reasons, but one of which is that refugees, displaced people, are only living there temporarily, which of course is the hope for many of these communities. But when we're talking about protracted refugee situations, the reality is that people have been there for decades and may be living there for decades, and they need to be included in planning processes, even if hopefully they are able to return home or settle permanently somewhere. We need to acknowledge the reality, which is that they might be living there, and need to be included in adaptation planning, and other plans for climate preparedness, disaster resilience. Um, I think the other big piece from COP30 and going ahead to COP31 has been, I think, in the context of right-wing movements, constrained budgets, the political developments that have been happening both here in the US, where I'm based, and around the world, is a real increase in xenophobia, in anti-immigrant sentiment, and anti-refugee sentiment, and pushbacks of people across borders to situations where it's unsafe for them. And this has been reflected in negotiators at COP being unwilling to mention support for refugees, support for migrants. We saw a lot more support or kind of broad brush stroke support for migrants in the text, but no mention of support for refugees or inclusion of refugees, which we have seen from previous decision texts. We see this in Dubai, we see this in Baku, but not from Belem. And so going ahead to Turkey, as you mentioned, Isatis, it's really important, but I think going to be quite sensitive politically to get countries to agree to continue supporting refugees and to intentionally include them in these processes. And I'll share from work that we've done with the government of Uganda. To have this meaningful participation is something that I think is so central to the ACE mission, which is that there has to be public awareness, education, access to information, as well as participation that's facilitated, and to ensure that refugees were included in the national adaptation planning process for Uganda as they're developing their NAP. We held a 3-day training in partnership with the government of Uganda to ensure that refugee leaders who were already working on climate in their communities from 12 of Uganda's refugee settlements were able to come to Kampala and learn about what the NAP process was, and how they could be part of it, and to share their work with the government and take that home to be part of district adaptation processes in Uganda. And so I think this is something we're hoping to take to other governments. Based on their Global Refugee Forum pledges, especially, and to bring forward to COP31 and to COP32 is how to really foster that sharing of information and engagement with communities that are affected so that they can meaningfully participate. And I think I'll leave it there just in the interest of time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, thank you. And seeing that we're 13 minutes before the end of our time, thanks for sharing, Jocelyn. So I want to pose a question, and some of you answered this, but as the audience, like you can put in the chat your questions, and we have Samuel that's moderating with us, and he will help us bring those into conversation. But while you are thinking about your question, I did wanted to ask the panelists, right? Like we call ACE a toolkit for driving a people-centered climate action agenda. And based on your community experience, what is one element that ACE must include or strengthen to actually serve your constituency? This is a rapid fire while people are thinking about their question and putting them in the chat. So whomever wants to raise their hand or share with us, feel free. Cito?
Thanks, Isatis. Two suggestions. Strengthen the global forum of local communities, helping to increase visibility and high-level political engagement. And the second one is work with negotiators to present the proposals of local communities so that they begin to appear in the final decisions of the COPs.
Thank you. Anyone else? Gordon?
Yeah, I won't repeat myself. So I think one thing that I didn't say is that what we often see is that good policy can be made and good plans can be made. And then when it comes to the crunch, when it comes to the actual doing, there's no money for it. So whatever inclusion we're talking about, and of course I'm talking about disability here, but it applies to everybody on the call. We need to make sure that budgeting and those who are making budget lines from the very beginning take into account everyone who will need to be included. Budgeting from the beginning, I guess, is the simple way to call it.
Yes. Finance, so important for this space, and a very critical gap that has been identify for many years. Hopefully now we'll get. So I have Babita, Saher, and then Brian.
Hi. So, I mean, reiterating the point what Gordon said about allocation of proper funding to women-led initiatives and also accessibility to climate education training programs and meaningful representation in decision-making bodies and the proper implementation. It is always good to have things implemented since inclusion of the language in the text is half battle done, and the rest lies in the proper implementation and monitoring of it. So, yes.
Saher?
Thank you. I think that what I want to also highlight is definitely the financial or monetary a, a support to children and young people to for them to implement their projects, ideas, and youth-led initiatives. But then something other, because this meeting or this webinar was focused on ACE in specific, and time and time again, whenever we hear children, young people's inclusion, ACE has been a main pillar. ACE has been a stronger pillar for young people's participation, for young people's engagement. And I think that it's also very important for us to push in a way that it's mainstream. I think that all of the stakeholders' rights and perspective, and especially the environmental human rights defenders' perspective, should be also mainstream across the negotiation agenda item. So I think that this is one of the main key takeaways, if I can say anything that you can take away with you, because ACE is the hot item this year, and there is a place inside it by which you can make good interlinkages between ACE and NDCs and ACE and other agenda items and so on. So I think that yeah, it's a good point to use it that way, and it's a good point to push it that way. Thank you.
Wonderful. Brian?
Thank you. I think one important point I want to make around how can the ACE support really the Indigenous peoples' rights is by also raising awareness in the institutional understanding that Indigenous peoples are rights holders, which is an important distinction. Indigenous peoples are not stakeholders, we are rights holders. And what that means is that we have a right to free, prior, and informed consent. We have a right to be consulted and to provide consent or not to provide consent, right? And this is important when understanding participation, how participation of Indigenous people should be understood in climate governance issues, because the issues are so varied, right, across topics, and raising the awareness and institutional understanding of how Indigenous people's rights should be respected and promoted is very important for us. Thank you.
All right. Mariana?
So I think it's disaggregation climate data, producing and analyzed through an intersectional lens of gender, race, age, and class, combined with meaningful community participation. Because without evidence that reflects who is most affected, there is no effect adaptation policy. With the recent launch of Brazil National Adaptation Plan, priority must be defined by the own robust data and the direction engagement of the most vulnerable communities for your implementation. So it's that. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And then, Samuel, if you have questions from the chat, you can ask them to our panelists.
Thank you, Isati. So several of the questions of the chat have also been responded in the chat because the conversation has been vivacious and proactive throughout this fantastic webinar that has brought so many people together from different parts of the world. But maybe some of the folks want to weigh in as well in the various issues that were raised. For instance, I see that there was a question for Babita specifically about what is the sweet spot for measurement between society as a whole, where data is to grow, and the individual where data is to find. And Babita did respond that question in the chat. I'm looking now for the response because there is so many insight that I've lost it now scrolling up and down. But I don't know if maybe other people in the panel also want to weigh in that regard. Yeah, I found it. I see that Babita did respond that the sweet spot for measurement is neither on the level of the abstract whole or at the level of isolated individual. It sits with the institutional and community level where power actually operates and where change becomes visible. And so this is something that Douglas, who made that question, agreed. And also Pavita added that inequality is structural, not personal, so our framework for measurement must also be structural. I don't know, Pavita, if you want to add to that, but I also see that both Wellington and Mariana raised their hands. So maybe, Mariana, you want to add something about that point? Oh, no problem. What about Wellington? Do you have a question that you would like to? No problem, Mariana. I saw your hand was raised, but that was maybe an old hand. Do you have, Wellington, a question that you would like to convey to the speakers as well? I see Wellington raise their hand,
Sorry,
but
can you repeat, please?
you did you raise your hand to ask a question, Wellington?
Maybe it was by mistake. It's fine.
No problem.
Thanks, Wellington. All right. So I love that we were active in between panel and question and chat. So that's wonderful. And we love to see that engagement moving forward. So as Saher mentioned, we have a deadline for a submission of ACE. In March 31st. We would love for you to write the submission from your own organization, but there are also efforts of bringing some joint submissions. So we're putting together, we have two global consultations that are happening, one on March 9 and another on March 10, depending on where in the globe you are, would be the day. So it will be the same consultation. This is just rotating the timing to make sure that we are accommodating folks. Um, so I'm gonna put here in the chat the links for you to register to these events. And I think then I would want us to leave here today with the importance of making sure that ACE is cross-cutting across the agendas and so that we can unlock the power that Action for Climate Empowerment can bring to making sure that climate actions is for the people and by the people, and that not one actor in any country um, can make all of the transformation that's necessary since climate change is kind of a new frame of life, right? Like it is changing everything that we know about how systems and how we relate to our surrounding world. So I saw in the chat of how you can send ideas about ACE. Thanks, Samuel. Yes, you can submit to the formal channel. So that's the UNFCCC submissions portal. And then you can also come to the consultations, which we put in the chat. There we will have it on March 9th and 10th. And the idea is for us to make sure that we can provide the best ideas to the UNFCCC ACE team and the ACE focal points that some of them are with us here today. So thank you so much for joining, for staying until the end to hear, what our different frontline groups have to say. This is a great community. It's normally a great a shared space for co-designing a decision. So that's what we hope. We want to energize this space and hope to see you engage not only now and in the consultations, but throughout the year, right? Like there will be different milestones of negotiation. So we just want you to come over and help us bring this to the finish line. So thanks so much, everyone, for joining. There will be more from us, but please stay in touch. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.